Hello everyone. Tonight we're not talking about fiction. We're not exploring characters in a book or a movie. We're talking about things that happened. Real events, real people, and the real terror they experienced during the rainy nights. Let's begin. The rain wasn't just falling. It was trying to beat the world into submission. It came down in sheets so thick you couldn't see 20 feet, past the windows of my toll booth. Each drop that hammered against the roof sounded like a tiny fist, and the wind that howled through the gaps in the old metal frame sounded like a lonely, miserable ghost. I'd been working this stretch of the I-17 for 3 years, and I'd never seen a storm this bad. It had started around sundown, a gentle pitter-patter, and had escalated into this biblical flood by the time my shift started at 10 p.m. Usually, this was a quiet post, a forgotten little booth on a stretch of highway that most people bypassed for the new 6-lane bridge a few miles north. My customers were mostly locals who preferred the old road, or lost tourists whose GPS had a cruel sense of humor. Tonight, though, there was no one. The world had wisely decided to stay indoors. I was alone, just me and the storm and a half. Finished book of crossword puzzles. The first sign that the night was going to be more than just wet and boring was when the lights flickered. They buzzed, dimmed to a weak orange, and then came back with a vengeance. The little computer that logged the tolls rebooted itself, and my small electric heater under the counter went silent for a moment before kicking back on with a groan. Standard procedure for a storm like this. I remember not even looking up from my puzzle. The clue was a final demand. 7 letters. I was stuck on it. That's when I saw the headlights. They were faint at first, 2 pale yellow circles swimming in the torrent, but they were definitely coming. I felt a small, stupid surge of relief. A customer. A brief, human interaction to break the monotony of the storm's symphony. I straightened up, put my pen down, and tried to peer through the rain-streaked glass. The car was old, ancient even. A big, black thing with rounded fenders and a high, stately roof, like something out of a black and white gangster movie. It moved slowly, almost majestically, through the downpour, its wipers struggling to keep up. It pulled up to my window, the engine rumbling with a low, deep thrum that I felt in the floor of the booth more than I heard it. I hit the button to open the window, and a spray of cold mist immediately washed over my face. "Evening," I said, trying to sound cheerful. "Just $1.50. I couldn't see the driver. The car's interior was a pit of shadows, and the rain on the windows distorted everything. But a hand emerged from the driver's side window. It was a long, pale hand, and the fingers were unnaturally thin. It wasn't wearing a glove, which seemed odd in the cold. The hand held out a coin. Not a collection of change, just one single, large silver coin, bigger than a $50. "Sorry, bud. I don't think I can take this," I said, squinting at it. It didn't look like any currency I knew. It was worn smooth with age, and there were markings on it I couldn't quite make out. The hand didn't move. I felt a strange pressure to just take it, to get the interaction over with. The silence stretched, filled only by the drumming of the rain and the low thrum of the engine. I sighed. Maybe it was some kind of collector's piece, and the guy was trying to be clever. Whatever. I took the coin. The second my fingers touched it, a shock of cold, not an electric shock, but a deep, profound cold, shot up my arm. It felt like holding a piece of ice that had been sitting in a freezer for 100 years. The coin was unnervingly heavy, and the surface felt slick, almost greasy. I dropped it into the metal collection tray with a loud clank. "There you go," I said, my voice a little shaky. "Have a safe night." The pale hand retreated back into the car. The window rolled up, and the old vehicle pulled away, its red taillights disappearing into the watery darkness almost instantly. I picked the coin out of the tray, my fingers tingling. It was still freezing cold. I set it aside on the counter, separate from the rest of the cash. I remember thinking that I'd ask my supervisor about it in the morning. A weird, but ultimately harmless encounter. I went back to my crossword. 10 minutes passed. The storm raged on. Then I saw them again. Headlights. I looked up expecting a different car, maybe a truck this time. But it was the same one, the same big, black, antique car. I frowned. That was impossible. This was a one-way toll plaza. To come back, he would have had to get off at the next exit, 5 miles down, and turn around. He couldn't have done that in 10 minutes, not in this weather. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe it was just a similar car. But as it pulled up, I knew. The low thrum of the engine, the struggling wipers, the sheer presence of it. It was the same car. This time, I didn't open the window right away. I just stared, my heart starting to beat a little faster. The driver's window rolled down again, and the same pale, thin hand emerged from the shadows, holding another one of those cold silver coins. "Look, I don't know what the game is," I said, my voice louder than I intended. I still couldn't see the driver, just that inky blackness inside the car. "You already paid." The hand remained unwavering. The coin glinted in the dim light of my booth. I felt that same weird, irrational pressure to just take it. Maybe he was confused. Maybe he thought it was a two-way toll. I reached out, my hand hesitating, and took the second coin. The same sickening cold shot through my nerves. It was even colder than the first one. I dropped it in the tray. It clattered against the metal, a lonely, final sound. The car drove off again into the storm. Now I was on edge. The crossword was forgotten. I stood up and paced the tiny confines of the booth, which suddenly felt less like a workplace and more like a cage. My mind was racing, trying to find a logical explanation. There had to be a U-turn slip somewhere I didn't know about. A service road. Something. But I knew this stretch of road. I knew it like the back of my hand. There was nothing. I picked up the phone to call dispatch, just to hear another human voice. I pressed the button. No dial tone. Just dead, empty silence. I tried my cell phone. No service. The storm must have knocked out the local tower. The feeling of isolation intensified, pressing in on me from all sides. The rhythmic drumming of the rain was no longer just noise. It was starting to sound like a countdown. I looked at the 2 coins on my counter. They seemed to absorb the light, giving nothing back. They were like 2 black holes in the shape of money. I had a sudden, horrible urge to throw them, as far as I could out into the night. That's when I heard a sound that wasn't the rain or the wind. It was a soft scratching sound. It was coming from the back door of the booth, the one that led to a small patch of grass before the highway fence. I froze, every muscle in my body tensed. I held my breath, listening. Scratch. Scratch. It was slow, deliberate, like a fingernail being dragged across the metal door. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a bulky fire extinguisher from under the counter. I crept towards the back door, my heart hammering against my ribs. The scratching stopped. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, just listening to the storm and the frantic beating of my own heart. Then the scratching started on the front window, the one facing the empty toll lane. I spun around, my blood turning to ice. There was nothing there, just the rain. But the sound was undeniable. Scratch. Scratch. Right on the glass, right in front of my face. And then I saw the headlights again. But this time, they weren't coming from down the highway. They were just there. The black car was sitting right in front of my booth, its engine silent. It hadn't driven up. It had simply appeared. The driver's side door creaked open. I didn't wait to see what would get out. I was filled with a primal, unthinking terror that bypassed all rational thought. I threw the fire extinguisher at the back door, not to break it down, but just as a distraction, a desperate, futile act of defiance. I yanked the door open and plunged out into the screaming storm. The wind and rain hit me like a physical blow. I was soaked in seconds, my clothes plastered to my skin. I didn't look back. I just ran. I scrambled over the wet grass, tore my jacket on the chain link fence as I climbed it, and landed in the muddy ditch on the other side. I ran into the woods that bordered the highway, branches whipping at my face, my feet sinking into the wet earth. I didn't know where I was going. I was just running away from the booth, from that car, from that terrible, unnatural silence where an engine should have been. I must have run for miles. I finally stumbled out of the woods and onto another road. It was pavement. I saw the blessed sight of taillights in the distance. I screamed, I waved my arms, and a semi-truck slowed to a halt, its air brakes hissing like a giant, angry snake. The driver, a big guy with a kind, weathered face, leaned over and opened the passenger door. "Jesus, kid, what are you doing out here in this mess? You look like you've seen a ghost." I couldn't even speak. I just climbed in, shivering, my teeth chattering. "Where'd you come from?" he asked, putting the truck in gear. "There ain't nothing out here. The toll booth." I managed to stammer out, pointing vaguely behind me. "Back on the I-17. The driver gave me a strange look. He was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the road. "Son," he said, his voice gentle, "there ain't no toll booth on the I-17. Not anymore. They tore that thing down 5, maybe 6 years ago when they finished the new bridge. That whole stretch of road is abandoned. Has been for years." I stared at him, my mind refusing to process his words. "No," I said. "No, I worked there. I was just there." He shook his head slowly. "Not possible. It's just weeds and cracked pavement now. Nothing out there but memories." I felt a cold dread creep over me that was worse than the chill of the rain. I thought about the booth, the crossword puzzle, the low thrum of the engine. It had all felt so real. I reached into my pocket, my fingers searching for my keys, my wallet, anything to ground me. My fingers closed around something small, hard and circular. I pulled it out. My hand was trembling so hard I could barely hold it steady. It was one of the coins. Large, silver, and unnervingly cold to the touch. In the dim light of the truck's dashboard, I could finally make out the inscription, worn but still legible. It wasn't any language I knew. It was a simple, stark engraving. A skeleton, a boat, and a single, final word. I didn't need a dictionary to understand it. The word was paid. I had finally found the answer to my crossword clue. A final demand. The answer was payment. I've always been a city person. I love the noise, the anonymity, the feeling of being a single, insignificant cell in a massive, living organism. It makes me feel safe. So when I found a top-floor apartment in one of those old, concrete brutalist towers downtown, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. The rent was cheap, the view was a stunning panorama of urban sprawl, and the walls were thick. Or so I thought. The first storm came about a month after I moved in. It was a proper mid-summer gully washer, the kind that turns the sky a bruised purple and makes the whole city smell like wet asphalt and ozone. I was curled up on my second-hand couch, feeling cozy and secure, listening to the rain lash against the big picture window. That's when I heard it for the first time. A whisper. It was faint, so faint that at first, I was sure it was just the wind. The building was old, probably full of drafts. The sound seemed to be coming from the large, metal air conditioning vent set high on the living room wall. It was a long, sibilant hiss, like air escaping a tire, but with a strange, almost vocal quality to it. I got up and stood under it, listening. It was just a low, continuous show. The wind, I told myself. Just the wind. I went to bed and didn't think about it again. The next time it rained, a week or so later, the sound was back. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just a hiss. There were inflections, rises and falls. It sounded, and this is going to seem crazy, like a person trying to talk just on the other side of a wall, their voice muffled and distorted. I couldn't make out any words, just the cadence of speech, a low, murmuring complaint. This time it unsettled me. I turned the TV up, tried to drown it out, but it was like the sound was on a frequency that cut right through everything else. It was a persistent, nagging presence in the room. The next morning, I called building maintenance. A weary-looking guy named Stan came up, tapped on the vent with a screwdriver, and shone a flashlight into it. "Nothing in there, miss," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the metal duct. "Probably just the wind getting in through a loose flap on the roof. These old buildings, they make all kinds of noise." He shrugged, gave me a, "What can you do?" look, and left. But I knew it wasn't the wind. The wind doesn't pause. It doesn't take breaths. The whispers became a feature of every rainy night. They were my unwanted, invisible roommate. I started to dread the rain. I'd check the weather forecast obsessively. A clear night meant peace. A 40% chance of precipitation meant a night of anxiety, of sitting on my couch and listening to the murmurs from the wall. I tried to record it on my phone, but all the microphone picked up was the sound of the rain and a faint, ambient hiss. It was for my ears only. Then came the night that changed everything. The night the whispers started making sense. It was another thunderstorm, a real monster this time. Lightning was splitting the sky every 30 seconds, followed by thunder that shook the whole building. And the voice from the vent was louder, more agitated. I was huddled in my armchair, a blanket pulled up to my chin, trying to read a book and pretend it wasn't happening, but the whispering was impossible to ignore. And then, clear as day, I heard a word. Cold. It was a long, drawn-out word, half sigh, half complaint. I froze, my book slipping from my fingers. I strained to listen. The murmuring continued, and then another word cut through the noise. Helpa. My blood ran cold. It wasn't my imagination. It was a voice, a weak, desperate voice, and it was coming from inside my walls. I scrambled over to the vent and pressed my ear against the cold metal. Hello, I called out, feeling insane. As someone there. The only answer was the steady stream of muffled complaints. But now I could hear it more clearly. It wasn't just random words. It was a sentence, repeated over and over again. So cold. Please help me. My rational mind tried to fight back. It had to be a crossed wire, a radio signal, someone's phone call getting picked up by the ductwork acting as a giant antenna. It had to be. But the voice didn't sound electronic. It sounded thin and wet and terrifyingly close. The next day, I went down to the library and dug into the city archives online. I searched for the building's address, looking for anything. Construction records, old news articles. I found it. A short 5-line article from a local paper dated November 1982. The headline read, "Woman missing from West, side apartment." It described how a 28-year-old woman named Elisa Vaughn had vanished from her top-floor apartment. There were no signs of a break-in, no signs of a struggle. All her belongings were still there. Her keys were on the kitchen counter. She had just disappeared. The last time anyone had seen her was during a severe thunderstorm that had knocked out power to half the city. The apartment number was 12B. My apartment. I felt a wave of nausea. I went back to my apartment and stared at the vent. "Elisa," I whispered. The apartment was silent. It only happened when it rained. The fear turned into a kind of grim obsession. I stopped going out. I stopped answering my phone. I just waited for the rain. When it came, I would sit there on the floor beneath the vent and listen. The whispers started to change. They weren't just asking for help anymore. They started talking to me. "Saw you today, liked your red scarf." I hadn't left the apartment, but I had been standing by the window earlier, wearing the red scarf my mother had sent me, singing in the shower, pretty voice. My nightly routine. The voice knew me. It was watching me. The feeling of safety I got from the city, from the anonymous tower, was gone. I was in a glass cage, and something was looking in. I tried covering the vent. I bought a huge roll of duct tape and sealed it completely, layer after layer. That night it rained. For the first time in weeks, there was silence from the living room vent. I almost cried with relief. I sat there, in the quiet, for about an hour. Then I heard it. A faint, scratching sound. It was coming from my bedroom. I walked slowly towards the bedroom door, my heart pounding. I pushed it open. The scratching was coming from the smaller, circular vent on the wall next to my bed. And then the whisper. Closer, more intimate. "Thought you could shut me out, I slept on the couch after that, with all the lights on. I couldn't be in that room anymore. I felt like I was losing my mind. The lack of sleep wasn't helping. I saw shadows in the corners of my eyes. The building's groans and creaks sounded like footsteps. I was a prisoner in my own home. I knew I had to leave. I started packing my things in a frenzy, throwing clothes and books into boxes. I had to get out before the next storm. But the sky had other plans. It opened up that afternoon with a ferocity I had never seen. The rain was almost horizontal, driven by a gale force wind. The sky was black at 3 in the afternoon, and the whispers started. But this time, it wasn't a whisper. It was a scream, a desperate, terrified scream coming from the main vent in the living room, the one I had taped over. The tape was straining, bulging outwards.
I just coming.
It backed away, stumbling over a packing box, and then I heard another sound, a low, grinding, scraping sound from deep within the vents. It sounded huge. It sounded heavy. The voice screamed again, a sound of pure agony. I tiscutalum, OHETSPLING. And then I saw it. The metal grill of the vent, the one Stan had tapped with a screwdriver, began to bend. It buckled outwards, the screws groaning, the metal screeching in protest. It was being pushed from the inside by a formless, powerful pressure. The screams were cut off with a final, sickening, wet, crunching sound. And then silence. A silence more terrifying than any of the whispers. Just the sound of the storm raging outside. The lights flickered and went out. I was plunged into total darkness. I don't know how long I sat there on the floor, shaking. An hour, 2. The power eventually came back on with a hum. I looked at the vent. The grill was mangled, bent outwards in a grotesque parody of a scream. The tape was torn to shreds. That was it. I grabbed my purse and my keys and ran for the door. I didn't care about my belongings. I would leave it all behind. I fumbled with the locks, my hands shaking too much to work properly. I finally got the door open and stumbled out into the hallway. And there was my neighbor from Twelly-C, Mrs. Gable, a sweet elderly woman who always smiled and asked how I was doing. She was standing in her doorway looking at me. "Oh, my dear," she said, her voice full of concern. "Are you all right? This storm is just dreadful, isn't it?" I couldn't speak. I just nodded, tears streaming down my face. She gave me a thin, strange smile. Her eyes seemed too wide, too dark. "I'm so glad you're okay," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I was getting so worried. I was calling and calling for you, but you didn't answer." She leaned a little closer. "Did you hear me?" she whispered, and it was the same voice. The same thin, wet, desperate voice from the vent. "I was trying to warn you. It gets so lonely in the walls when the storm comes, and it gets so hungry." It's been a year since Sarah passed. The silence in this house is the loudest thing I've ever heard. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind in the pines outside, it all just magnifies the space she used to fill. I bought this place with her, a small, isolated house on the edge of a national forest. It was supposed to be our escape, our forever home. Now, it's just my waiting room. My only company is Buster, her goofy, golden retriever. He's all I have left of her. The storm that night wasn't unexpected. The Weather Channel had been predicting it for days. A real monster, they said, sweeping down from the mountains. When the power finally went out around 9 p.m. with a fizz and a pop, I wasn't surprised. I lit the kerosene lamp Sarah had insisted we buy for romantic evenings, feeling a bitter pang of irony. Their warm, flickering glow cast long, dancing shadows across the living room. Outside, the rain was a solid wall of noise, and the wind was a physical force, making the whole house groan like a ship at sea. Buster, who usually loves storms, was agitated. He wasn't barking at the thunder. He was standing at the glass pane of the back door, his body rigid, a low, continuous growl rumbling in his chest. His hackles were up. "What is it, boy?" I asked, walking over to him. "Just the wind." He didn't relax. He pressed his nose against the cold glass, his growl deepening. The back door looked out over our small yard, which quickly gave way to the dense, black wall of the forest. The rain was so heavy I could barely see the tree line. I was about to turn away, to dismiss it as the dog just being spooked by the storm's intensity, when I saw it. A light. It was deep in the woods, maybe 100 yards in. It wasn't a fire. It was a single, small point of light, and it was glimmering, winking in and out of existence between the thick trunks of the trees. My first thought was a downed power line, but the light wasn't electric. It didn't crackle or spark. It was a steady, soft glow. Then I thought maybe it was a hiker, someone caught in the storm with a flashlight. I watched it for a minute. It wasn't moving in a way that made sense for a hiker. It would appear, hold steady for a few seconds, and then vanish, only to reappear a few feet to the left or right. It was as if someone was standing perfectly still, just occasionally moving the beam of their light. Buster started barking now, loud, frantic barks that echoed in the quiet house. He was scratching at the door, desperate to get out or to warn off whatever was out there. "Easy, boy, easy," I said, my own heart starting to beat a little faster. A knot of unease was tightening in my stomach. There was something unnatural about that light. It was a cold, sterile blue, not the warm yellow of a flashlight or a lantern. I did what any sensible person would do. I double-checked the lock on the back door and drew the thick curtain over the glass. Out of sight, out of mind, but I couldn't shake the image of that cold, blue glimmer in the suffocating darkness of the forest. Buster didn't stop barking. He moved away from the door and stood in the center of the living room, facing the back of the house, his barking turning into a distressed whining. I tried to read my book by the wavering lamplight, but the words just swam in front of my eyes. Every gust of wind against the house made me jump. Every creak of the old wood sounded like a footstep. The feeling of being watched was immense, a heavy blanket of dread smothering me. After about 20 minutes of this self-inflicted torture, I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to look again. I told myself it was just to prove that it was gone, that it was nothing. I pulled back a tiny corner of the curtain and peered out. My blood turned to ice. The light was no longer deep in the woods. It was at the edge of my property, right where the manicured lawn met the wild, untamed forest. It was much closer, and now I could see the source. It was a lantern, an old-fashioned oil lantern with glass panes, but the light it was emitting was that same, sick, blue-ish white, and someone was holding it. I couldn't make out a face or even a clear shape. It was just a tall, impossibly thin silhouette against the blackness. A stick figure wearing dark, wet clothes that hung from its frame. It was standing perfectly still, one arm raised, holding the lantern. It wasn't pointed at the house, it was held aloft, as if signaling, just standing there in the torrential, freezing rain, motionless. I dropped the curtain as if it were on fire. I backed away from the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Buster was cowering now, huddled under the kitchen table, whining pitifully. He knew what was out there was wrong. This wasn't a lost hiker. A hiker would be shouting for help, trying to find shelter. This thing, it was just waiting, watching. My mind raced. I fumbled for my cell phone on the counter. No service. Of course. The landline was dead too, the storm's first casualty. I was cut off. I was alone with this thing. I ran through the house, checking every lock on every window and door, my hands shaking so badly I could barely work the deadbolts. The house, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now felt like a fragile, wooden box. A trap. The wind howled, and a branch scraped against the roof. I nearly screamed. I forced myself to take deep breaths, to think. What did it want? Why was it just standing there? The questions hammered at my brain, each one more terrifying than the last. I had to look again. I don't know why. It was a morbid, self-destructive curiosity, a need to know if the threat was still there, or if it had gotten closer. I crept back to the back door, my feet silent on the wooden floor. My hand trembled as I lifted the curtain. It had moved. It was in my yard now, halfway between the forest and the house, and it was walking. But it wasn't walking. That's the only way I can describe it. Its legs weren't moving. It was gliding smoothly, serenely, over the soggy, muddy ground the lantern held before it. It was coming for the house. It was coming for me. Panic, pure and absolute, took over. I didn't scream. The sound was trapped in my throat. I just turned and ran. I ran to the safest place I could think of, the place Sarah and I had designed to be our sanctuary within a sanctuary. Our bedroom. It was at the front of the house, as far away from the back door as possible. It had a solid oak door with a heavy, old-fashioned lock. I slammed the door shut, turned the key, and threw the bolt. I shoved a heavy dresser in front of it for good measure. I was breathing like I'd just run a marathon. Buster was in there with me, scratching at the door, whimpering. He wanted out, away from me, away from the focal point of the danger. And then I heard it, a sound that made my heart stop. It was the sound of the back door splintering. A single, loud crack of wood, followed by a crash as it was torn from its hinges. It was in the house. I scrambled backwards, falling onto the bed, pulling the covers up to my chin like a child. I could hear it moving through the house. There were no footsteps, just a soft, wet, sliding sound. A squelching, dragging noise. It was slow, deliberate, methodical. It was exploring. I heard it pause in the kitchen, then in the living room. Each second of silence was an eternity of suspense. The sliding, wet sound started coming down the hallway, towards my bedroom. My breathing stopped. My entire world had shrunk to the space of that room, to the sound of that advancing, wet horror. It stopped right outside my door. The silence was absolute. Even the storm outside seemed to fade away, holding its breath. I could hear the blood pounding in my ears. I stared at the door, at the bottom where the light from the hallway would be, but there was no light, just darkness. Then came a knock. Not a loud, demanding bang, but a soft, gentle tap, 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 tap. It was a polite, almost hesitant knock. And then a voice spoke, and in that moment, my entire world shattered into a million pieces. Honey. It was Sarah's voice. It wasn't a memory. It wasn't a trick of the wind. It was her voice, clear as day, right on the other side of the door. The exact pitch, the exact gentle cadence that I had longed to hear for the past year. Honey. The storm was so bad. I got lost in the woods, but I saw our light. I followed the light home. My mind reeled. It couldn't be. She was gone. I had held her hand as she slipped away. I had buried her. This was a trick. A cruel, monstrous trick. The doorknob began to jiggle. "Can you let me in, honey?" Sarah's voice asked, a little tremor of cold in it now. "It's so cold out here. Please, open the door." And that's when I understood. A wave of comprehension so terrible it almost made me pass out. The glimmer, the cold, blue light I had seen in the woods. It wasn't the lantern. That wasn't its light. The blue glimmer was the light from my kerosene lamps, the light from my house, reflecting in its eyes as it stood in the darkness, watching me. It wasn't carrying a beacon, it was the beacon. It had followed my light, just like she said. It had followed Sarah's light home. "Let me in." Her voice pleaded again, and this time it was layered with something else. A wet, gurgling sound. "I'm home." I sat there on our bed in our sanctuary, and I listened to the sound of my dead wife trying to get in. The key in the lock slowly beginning to turn from the other side. House sitting for the Hendersons was supposed to be the easiest $500 I'd ever make. They were a nice, ridiculously wealthy family who treated me, their son's 17-year-old friend, like an actual human being. Their house was a work of art, all glass and white walls and minimalist furniture, like something out of a magazine. The gig was simple. Keep their hyperactive golden doodle from destroying the Italian leather sofa and water the plants. The best part, full unrestricted access to their indoor pool. The pool was the centerpiece of the house. It was in a huge, glass, enclosed room that looked out onto a meticulously landscaped Japanese garden. At night, with the underwater lights on, it was like swimming in a sapphire. I'd spent the first 2 days of the Hendersons' vacation living my best life, doing cannonballs and floating on my back, staring up at the stars through the glass ceiling. The third night, the weather turned. A summer storm rolled in, heavy and oppressive. The sky went from dusk to pitch black in a matter of minutes, and the rain started coming down in thick, noisy waves against the acres of glass. The dog Alfie was spooked by the thunder and had wedged himself under my bed upstairs. I was bored. The Wi-Fi was being spotty, and there's only so much you can watch on basic cable. So, naturally, I thought night swim. I changed into my trunks, grabbed a towel, and headed for the pool room. The air inside was warm and humid, thick with the clean, chemical smell of chlorine. I hit the switch for the underwater lights, and the pool glowed with that familiar, inviting blue. The rain was hammering against the glass walls and ceiling now, a deafening, chaotic rhythm. It was actually kind of cool, being in this warm, calm space while nature was having a tantrum right outside. I dove in. The water was perfect. I did a few lazy laps, the sound of the storm muffled and distant underwater. It was peaceful. I was floating on my back in the middle of the pool, looking up at the rain streaking down the glass ceiling, when I felt it. Something brushed against my calf. It was a light, feathery touch, but it was solid enough to make me flinch. My first thought was a leaf or some other debris that had somehow gotten into the pool. I kicked my legs out, treating water, and looked around. Nothing. Just the clear, blue, empty water. I shrugged it off. The pool's filtration system probably created weird currents. I decided to practice holding my breath, swimming down to the deep end. The Henderson's pool was seriously deep, maybe 12 feet at its lowest point. I took a huge gulp of air and plunged down, kicking towards the bottom. The pressure built in my ears, and the blue of the water deepened to an inky black below me. As my fingers brushed the smooth, tiled floor of the deep end, I opened my eyes, and I saw a shape. It was lying on the bottom, partially obscured by the pool's main drain. It was dark, long, and vaguely human-shaped. My lungs burned for air, and a jolt of panic shot through me. I kicked hard, rocketing towards the surface, and broke through with a desperate gasp. I swam to the edge as fast as I could and pulled myself out, my heart hammering. I stood there, dripping and shivering, staring into the deep end. From this angle, I couldn't see anything. The light from the underwater lamps reflected off the surface of the water, making it impossible to see the bottom clearly. It had to be a shadow. It had to be a trick of the light, the way the water distorted things. There was no other explanation, but I couldn't shake the image of that dark, still shape. The desire for a relaxing night's swim had completely evaporated. I grabbed my towel, dried off quickly, and killed the pool lights, plunging the room into darkness, lit only by the intermittent flashes of lightning from outside. I locked the glass sliding door that led from the living room to the pool, and made a mental note to keep it locked. I tried to settle down on the couch and watch a movie, with Alfie now whimpering at my feet. But I couldn't focus. My eyes kept darting back to the dark, glass wall of the pool room. Every time the lightning flashed, the huge, empty space was illuminated for a split second. The pool was a black, motionless rectangle. The diving board, the lounge chairs, everything was exactly as it should be. I was starting to feel stupid, letting my imagination get the better of me. It was just a creepy old house in a storm. I was about to get up and get a soda when another flash of lightning lit up the sky. I glanced at the pool room, and my heart stopped. The shape from the bottom of the pool wasn't on the bottom of the pool anymore. It was on the diving board. It was just for a second, a stark, black silhouette against the white fiberglass. It was the shape of a person, gaunt and dripping, standing hunched over at the end of the board. And then the darkness swallowed it again. I didn't move. I couldn't. I just sat there frozen, staring at the blackness where the pool room was. I told myself I didn't see it. It was an afterimage from the lightning, a retinal burn. It had to be. But I knew what I had seen. Then I heard a sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. A soft splash. It came from the locked pool room. A gentle, lapping sound, as if someone had just slipped into the water. It was followed by the rhythmic sound of quiet, methodical swimming. Lap after lap. A steady, unhurried pace. I backed away from the glass door, pulling a terrified Alfie with me. This wasn't happening. I was dreaming. I had to be. I bolted for the pantry, the only room in the house with no windows, and locked myself inside, huddling in the dark with the trembling dog. I sat there for what felt like hours, listening. The swimming sound stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. The storm raged on, and then I heard a new sound. Squelch, 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 wet footprints. They were coming from the direction of the pool room, but that was impossible. I had locked the door. I had checked it myself. Squelch, squelch. They were in the living room now, moving slowly across the polished concrete floors. The sound was agonizingly slow, deliberate. I held my breath, pressing my ear against the pantry door. Alfie let out a low, choked whine, and I clamped my hand over his muzzle. The wet footsteps stopped right outside the pantry door. I have never known a silence so profound, so full of menace. I was paralyzed by a fear so absolute it was almost a religious experience. I was going to die in a rich family's pantry, killed by a ghost swimmer. Then, after an eternity, the footsteps started again, moving away, heading towards the main staircase. They went up the stairs, each wet step a small, terrifying punctuation mark in the night. Then, nothing. I stayed in that pantry all night. I didn't sleep. I just sat there in the dark, clutching the dog, waiting for the sun to come up. When the first gray light of dawn filtered under the door, I finally found the courage to open it. The house was silent. The storm had passed. I crept out into the living room. There were no wet footprints. The floor was bone dry. The sliding door to the pool room was still locked. I unlocked it and looked inside. The pool was still and clear. The diving board was empty. Everything was normal. I convinced myself I had had a waking nightmare, a hallucination brought on by stress and the storm. The Hendersons came home the next morning. I tried to act normal, told them everything was fine. But as I was getting ready to leave, Mr. Henderson asked, "So, how was your stay? Did you enjoy the pool?" I hesitated.
Yeah, it was great. I lied.
"A little spooky during the storm last night, though." He chuckled. "Ah, yeah, the house can be a bit noisy. Did you happen to meet our other guest?" I frowned. "Other guest?" "Oh, just a little nickname we have," Mrs. Henderson said, coming into the room with a smile. "You must have met the midnight swimmer." I felt a cold dread wash over me. The what? Mr. Henderson leaned in, a conspiratorial grin on his face. The guy who owned the house before us. A real recluse. He drowned in the deep end about 10 years ago. The realtor was legally obligated to tell us. "Don't worry, he's harmless," Mrs. Henderson added cheerfully. "He just gets a bit restless during the big storms. Likes to wander the house. We hear him splashing around sometimes." She paused, her smile widening. "Did he try to tuck you in?" "He used to do that with our son when he was little. We'd find his blankets pulled up to his chin in the morning." I didn't answer. I just stared at her, my mind flashing back to the pantry. I had eventually drifted into a state of half-sleep, slumped against a bag of dog food. And I remembered, with a sudden, sickening clarity, the feeling of something cold and damp, gently pulling the thin jacket I was using as a blanket up to my neck. There's a certain kind of rain out in the West Texas plains that feels like the end of the world. It doesn't just fall, it attacks. It comes at the windshield like handfuls of gravel, and the wind tries to peel your rig right off the asphalt. I'd been driving for 18 hours straight, pushing my luck and a truck full of poultry to get to Phoenix ahead of schedule. My dispatcher's voice on the radio had been getting more and more frantic for the last hour. "Flash flood warnings, Jimmy. Every wash and gully is overflowing. Pull over. Find a spot and wait it out." I hated stopping. Stopping meant lost time, lost money. But when the water started sheeting across the highway, turning the road into a shallow, muddy river, I knew he was right. Up ahead through the maelstrom, I saw a flicker of neon. A single, hopeful word E8. It was a truck stop, one of those forgotten little places miles from any real town. A relic from a time before interstate highways had bypasses. I geared down and pulled my semi into the vast, mostly empty parking lot, the tires sinking into the gravel. There was only one other truck there, a rusty old Peterbilt that looked like it had been there for a decade. The diner itself was a low, squat building with big plate, glass windows that were rattling in their frames. I killed my engine, the silence that followed almost as loud as the storm had been. I grabbed my jacket and made a run for it, the 30 feet from my cab to the diner door feeling like a mile. The inside was still. That's the only word for it. The air was thick with the smell of old coffee and grease, but it was quiet, eerily quiet. The lights hummed overhead, casting a jaundiced, yellow glow on the red vinyl booths and the checkered floor. There was no music playing, no chatter from a television. The only sound was the relentless drumming of the rain on the flat roof. A woman was standing behind the counter, polishing a water glass with a dish rag. She was ageless, could have been 40 or 60. Her face was a mask of stoic indifference, and she didn't look up when I came in, the little bell over the door announcing my arrival with a cheerful jingle that felt wildly out of place. "Evening," I said, my voice sounding too loud. "Storm's a real beast." She just nodded, her eyes fixed on the glass she was polishing. I slid into a booth by the window, watching the rain, feeling a strange sense of unease settle over me. This place felt disconnected from the world, like a pocket of time that had stopped moving. A few minutes later, the door jingled again. A man came in, dripping water onto the floor. He was tall and gaunt, with a wild, haunted look in his eyes. He was the driver from the other truck. He didn't say a word to me or the waitress. He just slid into the booth opposite mine, his back to the counter, and stared out the window into the storm. The waitress moved then, her movements slow and deliberate. She came over with 2 heavy ceramic mugs of coffee and set one in front of me and one in front of the other driver. Neither of us had ordered it. The coffee was black and scalding hot. "On the house," she said, her voice flat and low. "Gonna be a long night." She went back to her spot behind the counter, back to her polishing. I took a sip of the coffee. It was strong, bitter. The other driver hadn't touched his. He just kept staring out the window, his hands clasped tightly on the table in front of him. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. "You broken down?" I finally asked, just to hear a voice. He flinched, as if my words had physically struck him. He turned his head slowly and looked at me. His eyes were bloodshot and full of a deep, weary sadness. "No," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "Not broken down, just stopped." He turned back to the window. I figured he didn't want to talk, so I let it be. I was tired anyway. But a few minutes later, he spoke again. His voice barely a whisper, not even looking at me. "It was a night just like this one," he said. "The rain was so heavy you couldn't see your own hood ornament. I was young, stupid, driving too fast. Had a fight with my girl." He paused, and I saw his knuckles turn white as he gripped his hands together. "There was a man," he continued, his voice cracking, "walking on the side of the road. I don't know where he came from, where he was going. He was just there. I didn't even see him until the last second. I swerved, but it was too late. The diner was suddenly freezing cold. The waitress was still polishing that same glass, her movements unchanging, rhythmic. I never stopped," the driver whispered, his breath fogging the window pane. "I just kept driving. Told myself no one would ever know, that he was probably a drifter, a nobody. But he wasn't a nobody to himself, was he? I see his face every time I close my eyes. Every time it rains." He finally turned to look at me, a desperate, pleading look on his face. "I feel like I've been driving in circles ever since, always ending up back on this same stretch of road, waiting." Before I could say anything, all the lights in the diner went out. We were plunged into an absolute, suffocating darkness. I heard a soft curse from my own lips, but there was no panic from the waitress. A second later, I saw the scratch of a match, and a single candle flickered to life on the counter, followed by another, and another. She had been prepared. She moved through the darkness, placing the candles on the tables, her face an impassive, shadowed mask. The other driver didn't seem to notice the power outage. He was staring at something out the window, his face pale in the flickering candlelight. "It's time," he said, his voice flat with resignation. "He's here for me?" He stood up, his chair scraping loudly on the floor. He dropped a crumpled $10 bill on the table next to his untouched coffee. He walked to the door, didn't even put on his jacket, and stepped out into the storm. I rushed to the window, my heart pounding, and peered out into the sheeting rain. I could just make out his figure, a dark shape walking slowly, deliberately, away from the diner and towards the road. He wasn't walking towards his truck. He was walking towards the center of the highway. Out in the distance, I saw a faint, flickering light, like someone trying to strike a faulty lighter. The driver was walking towards it. And then I heard it. Over the sound of the storm, I heard the unmistakable, sickening thud of a vehicle hitting a human body at high speed. It was a wet, final sound, but there were no headlights, no roar of an engine, no screech of tires, just the thud. And then the sound of the rain washing everything away. I backed away from the window, my mind screaming. The waitress hadn't moved. She just stood behind the counter, the candlelight dancing in her dark, empty eyes. I have to go, I stammered, throwing some money on my own table. I have to call someone. The phones are out, she said, her voice betraying no emotion. They always are when it rains. I didn't care. I ran out of that diner, back into the biblical fury of the storm. I scrambled into my cab, my hands shaking so hard I could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost made me sick. I didn't care about the floodwaters. I would take my chances. I put the truck in gear and pulled out of the parking lot, my tires spinning in the mud. As I turned onto the highway, my headlights swept across the front of the diner, and I saw them. The waitress was standing in the big plate glass window, just as before. But she wasn't alone. Standing next to her, his arms slung casually around her shoulders, was the driver from the other truck. His clothes were soaked, and his hair was plastered to his forehead, but he was smiling. A calm, peaceful smile. And standing on his other side was another figure, a man in an old-fashioned raincoat, dripping water onto the floor, his face obscured by shadows. They were all looking at me. As my headlights passed over the diner sign, I saw that it wasn't dead anymore. The neon was flickering, struggling against the rain. It wasn't spelling out the word E8. The A and the T were dark. The other letters were buzzing erratically, but I could make them out. One word, over and over, flashing in the darkness. PY. I slammed my foot on the accelerator and drove into the storm, my eyes locked on the road ahead. I didn't look in my rearview mirror. I didn't have to. I knew that the diner wasn't a stop. It was a destination. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that one day on a dark and stormy night, I would find myself pulling over there again. And this time, it would be my turn to pay. My job is a strange one. I'm a freelance acoustic archivist. What that means, basically, is that when a building of historical significance is slated for demolition, I'm sometimes hired to go in and record its sonic signature. I capture the unique way sound moves through its halls, the groans of its settling foundation, the whistle of wind through its window frames. It's a niche field, part science, part art, part ghost hunting, though I'd never admit to that last one. The Evergreen Estate was the big one, a sprawling, Gothic revival mansion that had been sitting empty for 50 years, slowly being reclaimed by the ivy and the damp Virginia climate. A developer had finally bought the land and was going to tear it down to put up luxury condos. I was given one weekend, a set of keys, and a fat paycheck to get in there and capture the soul of the place before it was gone forever. I arrived on a Friday afternoon, the sky the color of a fresh bruise. The estate was even more imposing in person than in the pictures. It loomed at the end of a long, winding driveway, a dark, hulking beast of a house with boarded-up windows and a sagging roof. I let myself in through the massive oak front door, the sound of the key turning in the rusty lock echoing through the cavernous foyer. The air inside was cold and smelled of dust, decay, and damp earth. I spent the first few hours setting up my Gear Ultra, sensitive condenser microphones in the grand ballroom, the library, and the master bedroom, parabolic dishes aimed at the high, vaulted ceilings, and a central mixing station in the foyer where all the feeds came together. I was like a technological spider, spinning a web of cables and sensors throughout the old house. By nightfall, the predicted thunderstorm had arrived. It wasn't just rain, it was a full-blown assault. Thunder cracked overhead like artillery fire, and the rain came down in a solid, roaring sheet. Perfect. A building's true character, its aches and pains, always comes out in a storm, I sat at my mixing station, my high-end headphones clamped over my ears, and I listened. The sounds were incredible. The deep, mournful groan of the main support beams under the strain of the wind. The high, whistling shriek of air being forced through a crack in a leaded glass window in the library. The percussive drumming of the rain on the slate roof. It was a symphony of decay, and I was its sole audience. I started doing playback, listening to the isolated tracks from each microphone. The ballroom mic was picking up the groans of the floorboards. The library mic was catching the rustle of what was probably a mouse nesting in a pile of rotted books. It was all normal, all expected. Then I listened to the feed from the nursery. Underneath the rumble of the storm, I heard something else. It was faint, on the very edge of hearing. Laughter. A child's laughter. It was a short, joyful little giggle. I ripped my headphones off. The house was silent, save for the storm. I put them back on, rewound the recording, and cranked the gain. There it was again. A giggle followed by a soft, whispering sound I couldn't decipher. My skin prickled. I told myself it was an anomaly. Radio frequency interference. A squirrel. There were 1,000 rational explanations. But it had sounded so present. So real. I tried to shake it off, and focused on another sound that was starting to intrigue me. A leak had sprung in the roof above the grand ballroom, and water was dripping onto the dusty hardwood floor. But the drips weren't random. They had a rhythm, a distinct repeating pattern. Plink, plonk, plink, plink, plonk. It was a waltz. A slow, 3-4 time signature. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. I left my station and walked to the entrance of the ballroom, a flashlight cutting a nervous path through the gloom. The room was immense, a cavern of shadows. I could hear the dripping clearly now. I swept my light across the floor and found the source. Several leaks, scattered across the ceiling, were dripping onto the floor. And the puddles they were forming, they weren't random. They were in pairs, arranged in a wide circle around the room. Exactly where pairs of dancers would stand. A cold finger of dread traced its way down my spine. This was no longer just about acoustics. This was something else. I felt an almost scientific compulsion to capture it. I went back to the foyer, grabbed my most sensitive microphone, a beautiful piece of German engineering that could probably hear a flea sneeze, and a battery-powered preamp. I brought it into the ballroom and set it up right in the center of the room, in the middle of the ghostly dance floor. I plugged my headphones directly into the preamp, isolating myself completely with the sound of the room. The dripping was mesmerizing, a spectral percussion section tuning up. I closed my eyes, just listening to the space. A massive clap of thunder exploded directly overhead. The lights on my mixing station in the foyer flickered and died. The entire house was plunged into an even deeper blackness, and all my equipment went dead. All of it, except for the battery-powered rig in front of me. In the sudden, shocking silence, with the roar of the storm momentarily gone from my ears, I heard it. It started softly, a single violin note, impossibly clear and pure through my headphones. Then another joined it, then a cello, then a full string section. An entire orchestra swelled to life inside my head, playing the most beautiful, heartbreaking waltz I had ever heard. It was rich, complex, and full of a profound sadness. I tore the headphones from my ears, my heart hammering against my ribs. The ballroom was dead silent. I couldn't hear a thing but my own ragged breathing and the faint, distant drumming of the rain. The music was gone. It was in the recording. It had to be a ghost in the machine, a freak electronic event. I put the headphones back on, my hands shaking. The orchestra was still there, playing its sorrowful tune. And then I heard the other sounds. The rustle of silk gowns. The soft shuffle of leather shoes on the dusty floor. The low murmur of voices too quiet to understand, but undeniably present. I was listening to a party that had happened decades ago. I was about to rip the headphones off for good, to grab my gear and run out into the storm, when a new sound cut through the music. A voice. A woman's voice, whispering directly into my ear, as if she were standing right behind me. It was not part of the recording. It was live, such lovely music. The voice whispered, A cold, airy sound that didn't disturb the air around me. It has been so long since we last danced. I stopped breathing. I was frozen in place, a statue of pure terror. I could feel a cold spot on the back of my neck, the kind of cold that has nothing to do with temperature. "Don't you dare leave," the voice hissed, its tone shifting from wistful to menacing. The host would be terribly offended. The dance has just begun. That broke the spell. I screamed, a raw, animal sound. I ripped the headphones off and threw them to the floor. I abandoned everything. My expensive microphones, my mixing board, all of it. I scrambled through the darkness of the house, guided only by the memory of the layout, banging into walls, tripping over my own cables. I burst out the front door and ran, not even bothering to close it behind me. I ran through the mud and the rain, got into my car, and drove away from that house as fast as I could, not looking back. Months passed. I tried to forget about it. I told my client my equipment had been destroyed by a lightning strike. I took the insurance money and tried to move on. I was working on a new project, mixing the audio for a historical documentary about the region. The producer gave me a box of old archival materials to digitize, mostly interviews and news reports. At the bottom of the box was a small, cylindrical object wrapped in wax paper. It was an old Edison wax cylinder, the precursor to the record. A faded label on it read, "Evergreen Estate Grand Ball, September 14, 1898. My blood ran cold. With trembling hands, I set up the equipment to play it. I placed the needle on the fragile, spinning cylinder. A burst of static and then music. It was the same waltz. The same haunting, beautiful, tragic melody I had heard in my headphones that night. It was thinner, scratchier, but it was undeniably the same piece of music. I listened, mesmerized and horrified, as the ghostly orchestra played from a needle on a cylinder over a century old. And as the waltz reached its crescendo, I heard something else, buried deep in the static and the surface noise of the recording. A faint sound that shouldn't have been there. It was a whisper underneath the music, and it was my name. I've always been scared of thunderstorms. Not the thunder or the lightning, not really. I was scared of the rain itself. The way it would streak down my bedroom window, making the world outside look like it was melting. My mom said I was being silly, but to me when I was 10, those streaks of water looked like long, skinny fingers trying to get in. This particular night, the storm was a bad one. My parents were at a dinner party across town, and I was stuck with a babysitter named Jessica. Jessica was 16 and thought she was the coolest person on the planet. To her, babysitting meant ordering a pizza, putting me to bed at 8:30 sharp, and then spending the rest of the night texting her boyfriend on the living room couch. She just tucked me in, which really meant she just pointed at my bed and said, "Get in." When the storm really started to kick off, the rain was coming down so hard it sounded like someone was throwing sand at the house. I lay in bed, my blankets pulled up to my nose, and did what I always did during a storm. I watched the window. The glass was a mess of shifting, writhing water streaks. I watched them race each other from the top of the pane to the bottom, a million tiny rivers. But then I noticed one that was different. It was near the top left corner, a single, fat drop of water, and it wasn't moving. I squinted, trying to see it better. The other drops were rushing past it, but this one was just stuck there, vibrating slightly. As I watched, it did something impossible. It started to move, not down, but sideways. It crawled slowly, deliberately, across the glass, against the flow of all the other raindrops. I sat up, my fear momentarily replaced by a weird fascination. It looked like a tiny, transparent slug. Then another drop nearby stopped its downward journey, and began to crawl sideways too. And another. They were all moving towards the same spot in the upper middle of the window, converging like tiny soldiers answering a silent command. As they merged, they formed a small, dark shape. It wasn't black, but a deep, murky gray, like a storm cloud. It was about the size of a quarter, and it wasn't on the outside of the glass, getting washed by the rain, and it wasn't on the inside of the glass, where I could touch it. It seemed to be in the glass itself, suspended between the two surfaces. "Jessica." I called out, my voice a little shaky. I heard a sigh from the living room. "What?" "There's something weird on my window. It's called rain, Leo. Go to sleep." "No, it's different. It's moving. I'm not coming in there unless someone is actively bleeding or on fire." She called back, her voice dripping with teenage annoyance. "Close your eyes." I turned back to the window. The shape was bigger now, maybe the size of my palm. It was starting to lose its roundness, elongating, sending out little tendrils. It was slowly, horrifically starting to look like a hand. A small, gray, shadowy hand made of trapped water and darkness, spreading out inside the pane of glass. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them again. It was still there. It wasn't a reflection. It wasn't a shadow from a tree branch. Tree branches don't have 5 distinct fingers. I watched, frozen, as the shadow hand flexed. The 5 fingers clenched into a fist, then slowly unfurled again. It was alive. A silent, 2-dimensional creature living inside my window. I wanted to scream for Jessica again, but I knew she wouldn't believe me. She'd just get mad. So I just sat there, my knuckles white as I gripped my blanket and watched. The hand began to press against the glass. I could see it. The glass began to bulge slightly inwards into my room. It was a subtle thing, a slight distortion of the light, but it was happening. The shadow in the glass was pushing its way into my world. The glass creaked a high, thin sound, like ice cracking. I scrambled out of bed and backed away, crab walking backwards until my back hit the opposite wall. I couldn't take my eyes off the window. Then the impossible happened. The shadow hand flattened itself against the inner surface of the glass and began to change. It wasn't solid anymore. It looked like a drop of black ink spreading on a piece of paper. It seeped, slowly and without a sound, through the solid pane of glass. A single black, oily droplet fell from the bottom of the shadow and landed on my white windowsill. Plop. Another followed, and another. They weren't water. They were thick, viscous, and utterly black. They pooled together on the sill, forming a small, trembling puddle of darkness. The puddle grew as more of the shadow seeped out of the window. Then, the puddle began to rise. It defied gravity, pulling itself up from the windowsill, forming a 3-dimensional shape. It was the hand, a perfect, glistening black hand, formed from the strange, inky liquid, hovering in the air above my windowsill. It was connected to a rising arm of the same substance, which was still pouring out of the glass. The hand flexed its fingers, and a few thick, black drops fell from its fingertips onto my bedroom carpet, making a soft, wet, pattering sound. That's when I screamed. It wasn't a word. It was just a raw, high-pitched sound of pure terror that I didn't know I was capable of making. The door flew open, and Jessica stood there, silhouetted by the light from the hallway, her face a mixture of anger and alarm. "Leo, what is wrong with you? I swear if you woke up my..." She stopped. Her eyes followed my terrified gaze from my face to the window. She flicked on the main light, and there was nothing there. The window was just a window, with rain streaking down the outside. The windowsill was clean and white. The carpet beneath it was dry. The shadowy hand, the black liquid, it was all gone. "What?" she said, her voice sharp. "What were you screaming at?" "The hand," I whispered, pointing with a trembling finger. It was right there. It came out of the window. Jessica rolled her eyes so hard I'm surprised they didn't fall out of her head. "Oh my God, Leo. You had a nightmare. That's it. A bad dream." She walked over, patted the windowsill condescendingly. "See, nothing. No monsters, no spooky hands. Just a window." She was so sure, so dismissive. I started to doubt myself. Had I dreamed it? Had I fallen asleep and had a hyper-realistic nightmare? It had felt so real. The sound of the drops hitting the carpet. "Now get back in bed," she ordered, her patience completely gone. "And if I hear one more peep out of you, I'm calling your mom and telling her you were a nightmare." Defeated, I trudged back to my bed and crawled under the covers. Jessica stood at the door for a second, shook her head, and shut the light off, plunging me back into the semi-darkness. I lay there, facing the wall, my back to the window, my whole body trembling. I listened to Jessica's footsteps go back to the living room and the faint sound of the TV starting up again. I didn't sleep. I just lay there, perfectly still, for what felt like hours, listening to the rain. And then I felt it. It started at the edge of my bed, near my feet. A patch of my blanket was suddenly cold and wet. I thought maybe the roof was leaking, that a drop had fallen on me. But the cold, wet spot wasn't staying in one place. It was spreading. A slow, creeping dampness, moving up the blanket inch by inch. It was moving towards me, I knew, with a certainty that was colder and sharper than any fear I had ever felt before, that it wasn't a leak from the roof. It was the puddle. It hadn't disappeared. It had just moved. I lay there, paralyzed in the dark, feeling the cold, wet patch on my blanket crawl its way up my legs, and I knew, without looking, that this time, there was no window between us. Taking the lighthouse keeper job at Sing. Jude's Rock wasn't a choice I made out of a love for the sea. It was an act of desperation. After losing my family in a car accident 6 months prior, the world had become too loud, too full of people and their pitying eyes. I needed silence. I needed isolation. St. Jude's offered both in spades. It was a jagged tooth of granite a mile off the coast, home to nothing but gulls, seals, and the 100-foot tower I was now supposed to command. The first few weeks were exactly what I needed. The rhythm of the life was simple, monastic. Clean the lens, check the fuel, watch the horizon. The constant low roar of the surf became a kind of white noise that drowned out the memories. I felt not happy, but numb, and numb was an improvement. The old keeper, a crusty sedog named Silas who was reluctantly retiring, had left the place in perfect order. He'd also left behind a stack of logbooks dating back almost a century. On quiet nights, I'd read them by the light of a single bulb, in the small living quarters at the base of the tower. They were mostly filled with weather reports and maintenance notes, but sometimes, a keeper's personality would shine through in a stray comment or a complaint about the gulls. The storm hit at the end of my first month, arriving with a sudden, violent fury that the marine forecast hadn't predicted. The sky turned the color of slate, and the sea, which had been placid and gray all day, churned into a white, capped nightmare. The waves, which usually just lapped at the base of the rock, were soon exploding against the tower itself, sending tremors all the way up to the lantern room. It was terrifying and magnificent. I felt small and insignificant, which was a comforting feeling. I was in the lantern room, watching the massive Fresnel lens rotate, its beam of light cutting a steady, reassuring path through the rain-choked darkness. Over the symphony of the storm, the howl of the wind, the crash of the waves, I started to hear another sound. It was a low, mournful hum. At first, I thought it was the wind whistling through a crack in the glass, or the vibration of the tower itself. It was a single, sustained note that seemed to weave in and out of the storm's chaos. But as I listened, I realized it wasn't a mechanical sound. It had a human quality. It was a voice, a man's voice, humming a simple, sad tune. I did a full circle of the lantern room, peering out each window into the maelstrom, seeing nothing but blackness and spray. The sound seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I checked my small, battery-powered radio, thinking maybe it was a stray broadcast, a ship in distress. The radio was dead, not even static. The humming continued, steady and relentless. It was a melody I felt I should know, a simple, looping sea shanty full of a deep, watery melancholy. It was getting under my skin, turning my magnificent isolation into something claustrophobic and menacing. To distract myself, I went back down to my quarters and pulled out one of the old logbooks. I opened it to a random page. The entry was dated 50 years ago to the day, October 27th. The handwriting was a spidery, panicked scrawl. Storm of the century, it read. Waves are clearing the lower deck. The sea is angry tonight. Lost the radio an hour ago. God help us. I flipped the page. The next entry was in a different hand, neater and more somber. October 28th. The storm has passed. Found poor Thomas's oilskin jacket snagged on the winch. No sign of him. A rogue wave must have taken him from the rocks while he was securing the dinghy. The sea took Thomas, but he still sings when it's angry. It's as if he's trying to soothe it. My blood ran cold. I looked up from the book, listening. The humming was still there, a low, sorrowful tune weaving through the roar of the wind. He still sings when it's angry. I tried to tell myself it was a coincidence, that the dead keeper's song was just a local legend, a ghost story born of tragedy and isolation. But the sound was so clear. I felt like I was going mad, my grief finally fracturing my sanity. And then the light went out. The massive lamp in the lantern room sputtered, flickered, and died. The reassuring beam that swept the sea was gone, plunging my world into near total darkness, lit only by the frantic flashes of lightning. The rhythmic, reassuring whir of the rotating mechanism fell silent. A cold, professional dread replaced my superstitious fear. A lighthouse without a light is just a rock. I was a danger to any ship out there. The backup generator for the lamp had failed. That meant I had to do the one thing I was dreading: go outside. I had to get onto the narrow iron catwalk that encircled the lantern room and manually restart the emergency igniter. I put on my heavy oilskin coat, my hands fumbling with the clasps. I took a deep breath and pulled open the heavy iron door that led to the catwalk. The force of the wind and rain almost tore the door from my hands. I was hit by a wall of spray so cold it felt like a punch. I clung to the doorway, my knuckles white, and the humming, it was deafening now. It wasn't coming from the tower or the wind. It was right there, right outside the door. I forced myself to step out onto the catwalk, my boots slipping on the wet iron. I gripped the railing so hard my bones ached. I was 100 feet up, in the middle of a hurricane, with nothing but a half-inch of iron between me and the churning black sea below. A flash of lightning illuminated the world in a stark, terrifying blue, white. And I saw him. He was clinging to the railing on the opposite side of the catwalk. A man. He was drenched. His old-fashioned keeper's uniform plastered to a body that seemed thin, translucent. Seaweed was tangled in his hair and beard. His face was pale, his eyes closed, and his head was tilted back as if gargling with salt water, his throat vibrating with that low, mournful, humming song. For a heartbeat, we were locked in that frozen tableau. Me, the new keeper, and him, the old one. Then the darkness crashed back in. I didn't even scream. I just scrambled back inside, slammed the iron door shut, and threw the bolt. I collapsed against it, my body shaking uncontrollably. I could still hear him, his song now muffled by the door, a constant, chilling lullaby from beyond the grave. I stayed there all night, huddled in the dark, listening to the drowned man sing to the storm. By dawn, it was over. The wind died down, the sea calmed, and the sun rose into a clean, washed sky. The humming was gone. I crept up to the lantern room, my legs like jelly. Through the window, I saw the catwalk was empty, and the light was on. The massive lens was rotating, its beam catching the morning sun. I hadn't fixed it, he had. A week later, the supply boat finally made it out. The captain, a friendly man named George, tossed me a line.
Heard you had a rough one,
He shouted over the engine. First real nor'easter can be a hell of a welcome. I just nodded, unable to speak. So, he said with a grin, hold Thomas keep you company. I froze, my hands tight on the rope. What did you say? George's grin widened. Thomas, the old keeper who got washed away. He sings during the bad storms. Gave me a right spook the first time I heard it years ago. He winked. But don't you worry, son. The old salts say he's a good luck charm. He paused, his expression turning serious for a moment as he looked out at the vast, calm expanse of the Atlantic. They say as long as you can hear his song, you're safe. It means the sea's already got a keeper. It means it's satisfied with him, and it ain't looking for another. I looked from his face to the massive, empty ocean, and then up at the silent, sun-drenched tower. I finally had the silence I craved. But I knew now it was a conditional silence. I was the keeper of the light, but he was the keeper of the storm. And I was trapped on this rock, waiting for the rain, knowing my only protection from the hungry sea was the ghost it had already claimed.